Welcome back to Variant Qur'an. I'm Dr. Daniel Brubaker. We have a very special day today. Stick around. I don't think you're going to want to miss it. Welcome back to Variant Qur'an. I'm Dr. Daniel Brubaker. I have as my guest today Dr. Asma Hilali. And you're going to want to hang around and hear our conversation as we talk about some of these important things. Asma Hilali is Associate Professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Lille. She completed a PhD thesis at École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris and previously held a postdoctoral fellowship at the Martin Luther University in Germany. Her last publication is with Stephen R. Burge, The Making of Religious Texts in Islam, the Fragment of the Whole. And that was published in 2019. Thank you, Asma, for being here with us. It's a great honor to have you and a great time to have this conversation. Well, we have a lot to talk about today. However, before we get into some of the specific questions that I have for you, I wanted to just give a very broad overview of the field of your research, and that overlaps, of course, with the work that I do. But and I wanted to set the stage by talking about some of the big questions and open it up for you to give your perspective of what are the major, what is the lay of the land, what are the big questions in the field right at this very moment?
I think the big questions in the field of Quranic studies are related. They are related to the main questions or the main issues raised since the 19th century Orientalism, especially the German Orientalism. That means the original text, the Quranic variants, and the chronology of the Quran. They are, of course, these questions are, of course, related. And searching for the original mushaf, for the oldest one, is mainly based on the study of Quranic variants and following the history of the Quran transmission as the Islamic sources taught us. The works on chronology took many new methods, and they are extremely improving in the last couple of the last decade, and we are nevertheless still turning in the same circle since Noldeke and since this parallel chronology that has been built parallel with what again the Islamic sources taught us about the different steps of transmission of the Quran to the Prophet and by the Prophet. Surprisingly, the field did not approach these concepts enough critically, in my opinion. Like, for example, the accumulation of discoveries of Quranic variants on the basis of manuscripts did not take into consideration enough, in my opinion, the historicity of the very concept of Quranic variant. And this is a subject, perhaps we go back to it
Sure.
when we talk about other topics. But I think the field of Quranic studies and of Quranic manuscript studies is in need of renewal of conceptual framework of studying the Quran. This is how I see the field today.
Yeah, so Asma, I agree with you that that the field has gone through a lot of development in recent years, but has not progressed nearly as far as it could. And one of the things, if I'm understanding and paraphrasing you correctly, is that the field has not until now taken adequate consideration of the full range of what we see in the manuscripts. And there's just a lot of analysis left to be done. Is that a fair statement of what you were stating? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So great. Well, so the next thing, and I know that your area of work and academic research is broader than just Quran manuscripts, but you have done work with Quran manuscripts. as you've looked at manuscripts, what are some of the interesting things that you have noticed, or the most surprising things that you've noticed inside the manuscripts?
The most important results I noted in the Quranic manuscript scholarship that strike me from the beginning. And I have to say that I'm not a Quran manuscript person. I'm rather a researcher who dealt mainly with the transmission of akhbar and hadith, and more precisely of the theoretical construction around concepts such as authenticity of hadith and of apocryphal character of hadith. So my study on the Quran occur in since 10 years and is related to specific concern I have with the way we study the transmission of texts in Islam. And in my opinion, the transmission of religious material should be taken as a whole. That means when we study the transmission of the Quran, we should take into consideration the transmission of the other texts like hadith, like akhbar, like qasas, like all the material that has been transmitted in the same time and sometimes in the same context, in the same circles of transmission. So this is how my interest with the Quran grew. And progressively, I found myself somehow by coincidence, I found myself in front of the Sanaa Palimpsest. And this is how I started my experience with editing Quran material, even if I already edit before manuscript of other genre. So what was by this I'm saying that sometimes I look at the field from outside because I'm somehow new in this field. So what surprises me most is that despite this big interest with the codex and with the question of what is the oldest vestige of muṣḥaf we have, and as you know, this accumulation grow according to the new discoveries. So it is at some moment we talk about the Sanaa leaves, and then we talk about the Tübingen Qur'an, and then we talk about the Birmingham Qur'an. So it's a question that will be always updated according to what we discover. Despite this activity of accumulating layers of new discoveries, we still do not have what is called the Uthmanic mushaf. And we don't have a complete Quran that we could identify as the Uthmanic version. That means the version that is considered by the Sunni Muslims as the reference, as historically accurate, and as the canonical Quran. We do not have neither the companion codices, muṣḥaf. So these are very important concepts that are not related to any kind of materiality. This is what surprises me most, is that we are referring to concepts and we do not have still, perhaps this will happen one day, of course, but we still do not have the material Quran, the material muṣḥaf, the Uthmanic or the Ali muṣḥaf or the
Yes, and I'm sorry. Okay, you froze up for a moment there. Yes, and I agree with that. I think that's very interesting, and obviously the absence of that. When we talk about the Uthmanic muṣḥaf, many people refer to it as a real thing because of the reports of the and this actually goes back to your prior statement about taking all the literature and its history into account and not merely using the latter to entirely formulate what happened with the former. So it is interesting that we talk about the Uthmanic mushaf as a thing, and it may well have been a thing, but when it comes to the manuscripts, we have perhaps shadows of it, but we do not have either a complete representation of what would be called the Uthmanic mushaf, to my understanding, and nor do we have any of the regional codices that have survived. And obviously this has come up in discussions probably with you and you and others, and I know that people have brought it up with me, and I have speculated on possibly the meaning of this. It has been mentioned to me that while these would have been very heavily used, and so they would have been worn out, and that's why they didn't survive. And I'm not sure that I find that to be a very compelling argument for what might have happened to them, but certainly it is possible. That would be one explanation.
Yes, of course, what I say does not mean that they're not historical, or there's a little possibility that they exist. Of course, the work like Michael Cook's important work that showed that very probably the companion codices did exist is, of course, very crucial and is important. But I'm just saying that we don't have the material Quran, the materiality of this codex. We cannot study this until the moment. Of course, perhaps someday we will.
Yeah, at least not that we've identified so far. We may have some pages of the regional codices. We just have not, so that brings us to a later question of how much material there is remains to be done, how much work there remains to be done on it. So then turning now a little bit toward your own research, Asma, what are some of the questions that are prominent in your own research, not merely limited to the manuscripts, but also just more broadly? Tell us a little bit about that.
What I'm most interested with in my work is the relationship between the different religious genres. And this is the relationship between the different genres, including the possibility of interaction and overlapping between different religious genres. Of course, I'm talking about the pre-canonical period. I'm talking about the period of what we call the early Islam and the early teaching milieu, in which the transmission of the material of Qur'an, of Hadith and Maghazi, etc., took place at the same in the same context, and was carried by the same actors, and sometimes written down in the same material. And this is something that has been already proved by experts in papyrology and early documents, etc. But in my opinion, this should be investigated more deeply, and we should take benefit of this information about this cohabitation. I don't know if you say it in English, this coexistence between different religious genres, in order to understand how this interaction, or this very closed channels of transmission affected the growth of all these genres. And this might also inform us about the tools of canonization of both the Qur'an, the Hadith, and the other material. Statement, it's not, of course, my idea, but it's this is an idea that we find in many works like Fredon or Albrecht Noth or Stefan Leder, all the experts of the biggest experts of transmission of religious material. And in my opinion, the Quranic studies should take benefit of all these studies and should not be a closed discipline that is based only on the study of the Quran text, because the Quran has never been isolated from other texts. We take, of course, a big debate on the relationship between the Quran and the biblical material taking place in a long time. And I think we should add to this important debate other genres that have been also played an important role in the history of the Quran, in my view.
Is there anything beyond the biblical, and by biblical I mean not merely the biblical text, but the traditions surrounding the biblical text and the various sects and so forth? Is there anything beyond that general flow and stream of things that you think to be particularly significant, or that you've become interested in looking at in relation to the Quran?
In the biblical Quranic studies?
No, I mean, in addition to, obviously, as you mentioned, there's been a great deal of attention and more, I think, it's certainly not exhausted by this point, but there's been a great deal of attention to, for example, whether you call obviously it's a fraught topic to talk about biblical influence upon the Quran or biblical sources or anything like that, but there's been a great deal of attention upon the relationship between the Quran and the earlier biblical material, including the rabbinic traditions and the other Christian sects, and the development of the Christian tradition. Is there anything outside of the sort of what we would call the Christian tradition and Christian texts that you think might be important in this area? And I think there is. I'm opening up the question for you.
I think I'm very curious to learn more about how these different material interact, not on the level of the textual composition, and not only in the level of textual analysis, but I'm very keen to know more about the actors, the people, the scholars, how they work, using which material, and in which how the learned milieu grow, and where, and in relationship to which kind of political decision, or in which kind of political institutions. I think all this information, we miss all this information in our field, and I think we need a deeper investigation at this level. Of course, I can imagine the answer is that we don't know anything about the 7th century, and but I think in this field there is a lot of speculation. The speculations are welcome when they lead to something constructive, something that allow knowledge to grow and to progress. So we still can also speculate on this aspect, by trying to identify who are, for example, the translators of the biblical material, and it's, for example, it would be much more interesting to know if we identify an intertext or between, for example, the Quran and the Bible. It would be very interesting to know what are who are the translators of the material, what kind of workshops work on.
And by translators of the material, you mean, for example, translators into Arabic? Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Into Arabic, yes.
Yes.
I agree, that would be important and relevant. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. We had a little bit of a lapse on the video there. I think that's very important, and there have been linguistic studies as well. Obviously, who are the translators and what are, and that leads to the related question of, were there some exegetical tradition or other things, for example, were they influenced by the way in which things were translated? I think that's the underlying import of what you're saying. We're running through our time here, but I don't want to miss the opportunity to get into the main thing that I think many people are interested in. And I know that you have moved on in your research from your work with the Sanaa Palimpsest, but we can't get away from this interview without talking about that, because you are one of only a very few number of people who have published and researched at a high level on this manuscript. And so your book is called the Sanaa Palimpsest, and there it is up on the screen. So I encourage everybody to go out and buy that book if you don't have it, as well as the other book that we mentioned. And so what I wanted to do is just spend a couple minutes talking about that, Asma, if you can remember the research that you have done on the Sanaa Palimpsest. It's been a little while now, but it is of interest now to people as we look back at these things. And sometimes this research that we do takes a life of its own after a period of some time. Asma, when I did it in an earlier video with, I made a brief introduction of what a palimpsest is, and just so that people, if they haven't seen that, they understand what we're talking about in a palimpsest is, it is a special kind of manuscript in which something was written, and then it was later washed off or erased, and then it was written again, or the manuscript page was reused. And sometimes what is rewritten on the page is completely different material, and in some cases it is the same type of text. And in the case of the Sanaa Palimpsest, what we're talking about is earlier, what was first written is something that can be identified as Quranic or Quranic type of material, and that was washed off, that was corrected, and then later completely washed off, and then rewritten with over with more Quranic material. And so obviously this is interesting because of all the questions that it raises. Why was it washed and rewritten? What are the two different, what are the differences between the lower, which would be the earlier text when we say lower text, and the upper text, and so forth. And so you went and wrote about this in your book, and you also created some charts of some of the differences between the lower text and the upper text, and also between both of those texts and the rasam of what is now the standard or considered the Uthmanic text traditionally. And so we want to talk about that for a few minutes. And the other thing I wanted to note, and this is to hear from you, but to just observe that I have compared your chart with my own research on mainly on later Quran manuscripts, and not found too much overlap in terms of corrections, in terms of what is corrected on that, or in terms of variance. Although when I'm looking at variance, I'm looking mainly at what's been corrected. I haven't looked at the broader text. But just to note that there hasn't been too much overlap, particularly between the lower text and what I have found in later corrections. So that to say, you have comments on the lower text, the characteristics and features of the lower text and of the upper text, I think.
Yes. So thank you for this question on the book. Let me just precise that, made a little precision, that this book is mainly an edition. Yeah. The most important part of is edition. So I'm not, this monograph doesn't have the pretension to bring a new theory about the Quran. It's in itself an exercise of an edition. That means making available material. Yeah. It's very difficult to access physically. That means in Sanaa, in Dar al-Makhtutat, and also in terms of circulation of the photos. As you know, all the photos are not available. Yeah. So making available an edition is a way to open the discussion, and this is what I attempt with this book. The most important thing in the Sanaa, what we call the Sanaa Palimpsest, that means the manuscript 27.1 held in Dar al-Makhtutat, is that it's an incomplete Quran, the way, according to the Quran we know today. It is supposed to be completed by some scholars, suppose that it could be, there's another part of the manuscript in another part of the library. We are still waiting to confirm this idea. To speak about the Quranic variants that occupy the most important part of the discussion. The lower text contains canonical variants. That means all the variants we find in the canonical collections, like Ibn Mujahid collection of variants. So they are, we can identify the variants in the upper text according to what we know about the canonical variants, the qira'at as we know them. The lower text, none of the textual features of the lower text coincide with the Quranic variants, with the canonical Quranic variants. This is why I suggested to think about this phenomenon in the lower text differently, in a way that in a way that we do not interpret any textual particularities with the same scope of the Quranic variants. And at this level, I thought we should have more, how to say, more possibilities of interpretation. And going back to what I said about the transmission of the Quran and Hadith and other material in circles of transmission in the early Islamic learned milieu, I was thinking when I read the lower text, when they deciphered the lower text, that all the material we have, all the Quranic material we have, or does not necessarily constitute part of a codex. Perhaps we have material that was intended to be used in other channel, and this might explain their storage in the false ceiling of the mosque, and this might explain the low quality of the parchment used to write the lower text, and this might explain the particularities of what we call the non-canonical Quranic variants in the lower text.
Yeah.
I have to say that I did not succeed to identify the variants in the lower text the way other colleagues did. That means I did not find a way to reconstruct some passages in a way that they fit within, for example, Ibn Mas'ud Codex. This was not my interpretation of the script. Mm-hmm. So my interpretation is subjective, like any other interpretation of the palimpsest, because interpreting this palimpsest is reconstructing, rewriting the text somehow. And this implies a big level of, how to say, objectivity, even if at the end it's still a subjective exercise. So my idea that the lower text perhaps was a school exercise is based on a discussion with the other works on the Sanaa Palimpsest. And any interpretation of the script is a contribution in a chain of interpretation, as I said, of the script and in the academic discussion about the manuscript. So what Elisabeth Puin calls deviations are, in my opinion, something should be interpreted in another way, because deviations means that there was necessarily a reference, like a copy, a right copy that the scribe was following. And these deviations explain, following Elisabeth Puin, the erasure or the washing up of the text. In my opinion, the manuscript was not intended to be conserved, and this is why it has been used it has been recycled.
Yeah. Even from the start, you think it was not intended to be preserved?
In my opinion, yes.
Yes.
My idea, my hypothesis is based on the textual features that I call variation, not variant, to take into consideration that they do not fit with the canonical variant. and is based also, my interpretation is also based on the number of orthographic errors. For example, in folio 6a, in folio 9b, there are orthographic errors made by the scribe and corrected by the scribe himself or herself.
Mm-hmm.
They are not corrected by a corrector hand, but they're corrected by the same, using the same ink and by the same scribe. Mm-hmm. So, but the most important part of the manuscript is, of the lower text, is the reading instruction. This reading instruction made me think that this might be a school exercise. This reading instruction we find in folio 5a is at the beginning of chapter 9. This reading instruction says, do not say in the name of God at this level of the Qur'an. la-taqul, bismillah. Mm-hmm. So in my opinion, this refers to a context of teaching, learning, perhaps in a dictation session, this passage of the Qur'an.
Yeah.
And this what made me think about a school exercise. Mm-hmm. This instruction has not been deleted. And there is a basmala indeed that written before this reading instruction. And the very existence of this reading instruction is, in my view, a sign that this manuscript was not intended to be conserved in a mosque or used as a codex for reader or for Muslim, for believers to use.
So thank you for that good and full summary of that. And so just so for clarification for our viewers, what Asma has just talked about, the last part, is one of the things that has been discussed most about her book, which is the idea, number one, that it was a school text, that this originally was something used in a school setting, not for the production of a book. And then secondly, that the part of the text that was written in there was written that said la-taqul bismillah, after the erasure of the bismillah at the beginning of chapter 9, is an indication of, or supports this theory. And I don't remember all the details about the, I want to come back to a couple of the other things that you mentioned too, which are interesting, concerning variance versus variations, but there was a presentation made, and I don't remember exactly who made it, at a conference several years ago relating to this issue, where it was pointed out that that same rasam text, the same skeletal text, could be read on fall. Yeah. And with the and I don't know if he saw a shadow of an aleph before that lam, but is one of the it is instructive to remember. And it brings up another issue that I've been dealing with a lot in my work as well, and that is that the rasam can sometimes be read in different ways. And so it's definitely worth thinking about the possibility that not everything was made for production of a muṣḥaf, or not everything that was made for that purpose was actually wound up being used in that purpose. This manuscript was found in between the inner and outer wall of the Sanaa Mosque, along with many others. And I think some of the ones that were found in there, many of them were actually from Masahif, if I'm not mistaken, but for whatever reason they were stored in that place.
I think what we need most about the thousands of fragments found in Sanaa is more information, more clarity, more transparency about the way they were found, because they have been dispatched after they have been collected, by the German mission. And we need more information about how, what are the criteria exactly, the way about they have been collected in such and such way.
Yeah.
To be able to interpret all this material in a constructive way, in a way that create like new real progress in Quranic manuscript studies.
What do you mean when you say how they've been found? How they were dealt with after they found, how they were unpacked and labeled and so forth? Okay.
How they were organized, like as collections,
Okay.
We need to know more. We know a little bit. There are few articles
Yeah.
but not enough, I think.
And you have been there. I've not been there yet myself, but I've worked with some of the material and from the Sanaa UNESCO CD-ROM and other material. But what was your experience of the material when you were there?
Yeah, when I was there, it was a great experience because what I learned in my stay in Sanaa is that there are a lot of people who are totally able to work on this manuscript, but they don't. People who work in Dar Makhtutat know very well the material. They
Oh,
know, yes, they know the manuscript. We had great discussions about this material, but we don't have the same tradition of publications. My experience in Dar Makhtutat was great in the sense that I had access to the manuscript. I was extremely impressed by the manuscript. I was surprised by the shape of the manuscript. I expected that the material is extremely damaged, but it is not.
mm-hmm.
I was also impressed by how much the lower text was clear and appeared very clearly behind the lower text.
Yeah.
So I think if without any kind of post-processing photos, one can work on this manuscript in Dar Makhtutat in Sanaa very, very easily, actually.
Yes. Well, and this is a very good point that I've found many times as well. And it's hard perhaps for somebody who's not actually handled the manuscripts directly, but even a very, very good photograph is not as good as looking at the manuscript directly. It makes a big difference to be able to handle it at different angles, maybe hold it up to the light or different things like that. And that also, you mentioned something about the process of making an edition. So I wanted to bring that back because viewers should understand that there is this is both a science and an art. And so what you've done, anytime anybody makes an edition of a manuscript, you are, and that is meaning transcribing what is written there, particularly on the lower text, you are creating a reconstruction of what you see on the page. And it is an interpretation, although, as you can say, sometimes you can see it very clearly, and then sometimes there are parts that are obscured in some way, and so you have to make a judgment about what is there. But well, how do we bring?
There is. Sorry.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I would like to.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, I just want to say that it is an interpretation. It is a subjective. It is a subjective exercise somehow, but there is still the intellectual honesty.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That can't be overlooked, and that's very true. There's something that's not that is beyond argument.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's right. And so the other people, well, I mean, you mentioned in passing Elisabeth Puin and her work, and just to note that there are other people who have done work on this, and you've worked from different photographs, and the working from different starting material makes a difference sometimes in the and taking all these things together is very important in order to be able to make a this is why we do what we do, is we contribute to a larger discussion.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It has been asked by one of our viewers whether you consider that there's any possibility, and you've already said that you think it was a school text or a school exercise. Well, actually, it is still interesting, the variance that exists there. And even if it was a school exercise, the question remains, why were these variations in there? Was it read from a dictation, or was it read from a copying? Whatever the case, what gave rise to the variations in the text there? Do you have any thoughts on that before we continue with the last question?
I think all my interest with the circles of transmission, the circles of teaching and learning, is that these are the context when the text progresses. And one of the aspects of the progression of the text are the commentary, the glosses.
Yeah.
I think that these variations, what I actually, it's not me who call them variations, or other scholars call them variations. These variations are a kind of glosses. In many, there are 45 examples. We can find them listed in my book, and they are, and also in the work of Sadeghi and Boudarsi and Puin. Most of our interpretation actually coincide. There are some differences, but most of the work is very close. The three works are very close to each other. Many of these variations are glosses. Mm-hmm. One of the examples that came to my mind is in the Surah Al-Maryam, when in the verse يا ليتني مت قبل هذا. And we read in the law text يا ليتني مت قبل هذا اليوم. اليوم, we can call it an addition. It is a variation. It is not a canonical variant, but it's a precision about what is this demonstration is about.
Yes.
So this is how I explain the presence of these variations. I think it's a context of explanation, of commentary of what is the text about. And we have this shape of the text, and this is how we can understand the particularities of this manuscript. And yes, this is why we don't have, perhaps we will not find another manuscript that is which is similar to this one, precisely for this reason.
Well, there are so many more manuscripts remaining, as we've talked about before, to be studied, and the majority of the manuscripts have not yet been analyzed and looked at. But the point that when we are looking at any variation or correction, we look at a range of possible explanations for what they could be, and the gloss, the explanation or the interpretive aspect that is sometimes present there is one of the possible explanations for a variant. So that's all right. Well, thank you very much, Asma, for being here with us today. It's great to talk to you. I hope you are doing very well in your continued research and teaching. And I know teaching is a heavy burden to do while you're also doing writing and research. So great to talk with you. We'll talk with you again sometime soon. And thank you on behalf of everybody who's watching for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
All right. We'll talk to you later. Bye.